Now, there's an alarmingly high number of people who believe that Joe Miller, because of his paternal sensibility, becomes this irredeemable and unforgivable monster by the end of The Last of Us. The same people that gives him reverence for his unwavering perseverance to protect Ellie are sometimes the same people that besmirches his very reputation. They say, yes, he saved a little girl, but at what cost? Humanity? They blame him for undermining Ellie's rights and yet turn a blind eye to the shady organization that instigated it. They say, yes, we love Joel, but make no mistake, he was a terrible human being. He crossed a lot of people, he killed a lot of people, and in the end, he only thought of himself. Now, if this is all irrefutable truth, then you'd have to ask yourself, why do we even like the guy? Why do we inadvertently make ourselves hypocrites for a character that we undeniably know in our hearts was a terrible human being? Why all the hysterical outrage when The Last of Us 2 leaked? And the people who willingly exposed themselves to those leaks were furious when they found out that Joe died early in the game. Why all this fake reverence for a character that was supposedly a monster? Maybe because the simple answer is he wasn't one. Maybe because some of us truly believe that he was a morally just character who had to perform in the end a desperate act to preserve human decency in a world where there are none. I've always found the disparaging notions about him absurd. Did these people play the same game that I played? Because the game that I played clearly demonstrates that Joe Miller was a rational human being that wasn't tone deaf to reason, when or if a reasonable option was presented to him. This video is going to be about examining Joe Miller as a person from his perspective, how he treated his fellow non-fungal human beings, and how these same people felt about him when applicable. Was he cruel and unjust? Was he unreasonable and indifferent? What were the contexts of his interactions with some of these people? And ultimately, was he morally justified to do what he did at the end of the game? With that said, this will be my defense of Joe Miller.
See what they need.
What do you think you're doing? Keep driving.
I got a kid, Joe.
So do we.
But we have room.
Keep driving, Tommy.
Joe deliberately ignores a stranded family cries for help as he, Sarah, and Tommy attempts to leave town. Sarah and Tommy wanted to help, but Joe adamantly refuses to render aid. Was Joe wrong to have ignored the family in distress? If Joe had encountered his family before the outbreak, or even before hearing news of a pandemic sweeping across the country, then it would have been indecent for him not to have stopped to give assistance. But the fact is, this did occur during the beginning of the outbreak. Joe had already seen some horrific incidents before this moment. Just hours ago, he witnessed a rabid, erratic, and dangerous behavior by his next-door neighbor, whom he had to kill in cold blood in front of Sarah. Extreme moments like this can be traumatizing. No one knew how the virus was being transmitted, or how contagious it is, or even how long before a victim turns once infected. His primary concern is to protect his daughter and brother, and to invite strangers, no matter whom they seem to be, would be exposing themselves to too many unknown variables. It's heartbreaking for him to have ignored the family, but logically it makes perfect sense seeing what he's already seen and experienced. Realistically, I'd wager most people caught in the same dilemma would have done exactly what Joel did. You'd have to be able to help yourself and your family first, before you can help others in such an unprecedented situation. I know it's a hard and crude answer, even harder to be noble in a time of such crisis. This definitely presents a flaw in Joe's moral characterization, but it doesn't make him out to be irredeemable or immoral. Matter of fact, it makes him more human and believable. Robert. Double agent, triple agent. He's just on a long list of shitty people. He was willing to work with the Fireflies only to turn on them when they were at their weakest. He even tries to kill Tess after selling off her merchandise to the Fireflies. Sure, Joel and Tess had to kill a bunch of his men to get to him, but only because they weren't going to be allowed to safely saunter up to his office for a cordial discourse. Joel kicks him in the face, breaks his arm, and Tess eventually shoots him. There's no letting Robert walk. He seems to be very vindictive and petty. Tess had to put him down like a rabid dog. He had it coming, he won't be missed. Can't blame Joel or Tess for Robert's demise. Did Joel have to kill these people? Did he overreact? They were only doing their job. Could he have just immobilized or subdued them? Ellie instigates the attack because we all know what federal protocols are towards people with infection. No judge, no jury, just straight execution. Ellie's presumption got the best of her and she reacted. There was going to be no talking their way out of this unfortunate situation. It became too chaotic. Joel and Tess had to make a snap decision, which meant taking the lives of 2 federal agents. If you are sympathetic to the Fireflies' cause, then Joel and Tess made the right call. It was just a shitty situation all around.
What are we doing here? This is not us.
What do you know about us? About me?
I know that you are smarter than this.
Really? Guess what? We're shitty people, Joel.
What does she mean by this? A smuggler usually operates within the shadows in these types of stories. They are not entirely good or entirely bad. Their clients consist of highly dubious individuals with questionable motives, but as long as the smugglers don't ask questions, the transactions are relatively successful. Now, we don't really have a solid backstory on Tess, but there are good indicators that points to some type of mutual understanding, whether romantic or strictly professional, between her and Joel. Because of this, I can make this conjecture. I can only presume what Tess means to say is that she doesn't see her profession as a smuggler befitting the good of the nation. She has to constantly deal with the dregs of society like Robert and to some extent the Fireflies. Tess ultimately feels that her life has been meaningless, and Joel is right there with her, both spiritually and socially bankrupt. But after getting infected herself and witnessing Ellie's miracle, she has a moment of clarity. If her life had been meaningless, then she wanted her death to have mattered. That's why she desperately pleaded with Joel to continue the journey with Ellie, even though she knew he wasn't sympathetic to the cause. If Joel was indeed indifferent and selfish, he could have just walked away. He had no reason to finish the job since the clients were dead and no one enough to pay him. But because he has a sense of loyalty to a person he had truly cared for, he reluctantly continues with the mission even though it went against his better judgment. He wanted to do right by Tess. So tell me, is this a sign of a broken, selfish man? I think not. Bill is an eccentric and loyal introvert, possibly even a hermit. He owed Joel a favor and did good on his promise. We don't truly know how he feels about Joel, but we do know that he highly respects him. Joel and Henry's first encounter could have ended up really bad. The only reason why Sam didn't shoot Joel was because of Ellie's presence. They were both being hunted by the hunters, and hunters aren't fond of children, you know, the whole survival of the fittest and all. But aside from their brief beatdown, they became pretty cordial. They both had a common cause, having young children to protect and finding the Fireflies. Soon they are propelled to a very stressful engagement. Conflicted whether to keep his younger brother Sam out of danger by ditching Joel and Ellie, or to extend a helping hand which could present an immediate danger to Sam, Henry decides on the former and leaves Joel and Ellie to fend for themselves, presuming on the account that Joel and Ellie were capable of escaping the hunters. Joel and Ellie are forced to jump off a bridge into the cold ocean and are swept away by the unrelenting current of the ocean waves. They are hurled into a rock face and become incapacitated. Henry and Sam saw them jumped and immediately went to provide assistance, understanding that the danger from the hunters were over. Upon regaining consciousness, Joel goes off on Henry for leaving them. If Joel was truly an asshole and a hypocrite, he could have shot Henry on the spot for betraying their trust. But as we have come to know, Joe is a pretty reasonable person. Henry puts up a decent argument as to why he had to leave them behind and why he eventually returned. Now, we will never know if Joe would have done the same thing if the roles were reversed, because people still give him shit for ignoring the stranded family. But that was an entirely different set of circumstances. The stranded family were complete strangers and no one yet knew how contagious the virus was, or how it was transmitted. Joel and Henry had a pact. They developed a mutual relationship that required trust. Joel had every right to be angry with Henry. So when Sam turns after getting infected, Henry had to kill his own brother. Henry could have also shot Joel in his manic state. But I like to believe that with their brief time together, Joel and Henry formed a lasting bond. With that understanding, Henry, in his deepest despair, couldn't allow himself to inflict cruelty onto Joel, and ultimately blames himself for his brother's demise. In a different life, they could have been the best of friends, or maybe even brothers.
Now, you see, I believe that everything happens for a reason.
Sure.
I do. And I can prove it to you. Now, this winter, that's been especially cruel. A few weeks back, I sent a group of men out to a nearby town to look for food. Only a few came back. They said that the others had been slaughtered by a crazy man. And get this, he's a crazy man traveling with a little girl.
David really never encounters Joel, but he does have a unique perspective about him. He calls Joel the crazy man that slaughtered his people. He's brimming with righteous indignation and wants Joel to account for his supposed crimes. The thing about intriguing villains is that they don't know that they're villains. They think they are the victims or the rising heroes. David accuses Joel of murdering his posse, but like any true villain, they almost always omit pertinent information.
Fireflies?
Get down!
Oh!
If this is your idea of greeting strangers, by sniping them from afar and closing in with your machetes drawn, then don't be surprised if some of these strangers decide to fight back. This is a no-brainer. David's people drew first blood, and they had it coming. And concerning David's thugs, Joel needed to find Ellie, and they were on the way. They weren't going to parlay and it's kill or be killed with these people. It just turns out that Joel was the better killer. Joel and Tommy's relationship have been quite strenuous after the outbreak. We know from Tommy's confession that he was traumatized by Joel's mistreatment of him during their survival back in Boston. It's even implied that Joel may have physically abused him. When they meet up at the power plant, Tommy seems much more confident and assured of himself. This is the Tommy that can probably go toe-to-toe with his big brother. Now, the sequence where Tommy defies Joel's aggressive proposition to take Ellie off of his hands seems to have left a negative impression on some people. They assume that Tommy harbors a deep resentment towards Joel, and that their relationship had been severely damaged. They are more confused at Tommy's adamant portrayal of a distraught brother seeking vengeance for a person whom he had lost all respect for in The Last of Us 2. They feel that Tommy's character felt inconsistent for indulging such righteous indignation. Personally, I don't even know how anyone could come to such flagrant conclusion after playing both games. Tommy has the utmost respect and reverence for Joel. They may have had their disagreement on how to survive after the outbreak, and Joel may have made some terrible decisions that ultimately pushed Tommy away. But make no mistake, Tommy has always loved his big brother, despite their overwhelming differences and ideology. The first noticeable example that Tommy didn't harbor such scathing emotions towards Joel after their separation was his sentimentality in retrieving Joel and Sarah's picture when he went back to Texas. If Tommy hated his brother's guts, why did he feel the need to procure such a sentimental object, kept it safe, and hoped to one day return it to his big brother? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? This next example is the most important gesture that Tommy does to show his total and complete devotion to his big brother. During their heated discussion about Ellie, Tommy made it clear that if Joel resorted to his old ways and began to get physical with them, it wouldn't turn out good for Joel. But of course, they are conveniently attacked by bandits. After the skirmish, whatever grudges or displeasure Tommy felt about Joel, it was completely absolved moments later when he witnesses Joel's paternal care for Ellie. Tommy always knew that Joel was a great father to Sarah, and he immediately understood, as only a brother can, why Joel was trying to get rid of Ellie. Tommy innately understood that Joel did not want to become attached to a little girl that resembled Sarah. So of course, Tommy, being a compassionate and caring brother, decides to take Ellie to assuage Joel's conscience. What more could a compassionate brother do? My final example of Tommy's devotion to Joel will be from The Last of Us 2. After surviving the calculated and brutal murder of his brother, Tommy still had the clarity to serve Joel's memory. He understood that Joel would not want Ellie to put herself in danger to avenge him. And so he puts on a front to stall her, knowing he was already going. This is a man that has every right to seek justice. And even then, he has the decency to try and protect his brother's surrogate daughter from the agonizing trauma of cold-blooded vengeance. So for anyone to still maintain the belief that Tommy's character seemed out of place and inconsistent in The Last of Us 2 is just baffling to me. The Last of Us 2 isn't only about Ellie and Abby's revenge, it's also about Tommy's. Ellie and Joel's relationship have been somewhat tumultuous, to say the least. Ellie never really knew her mother, and her father was pretty much non-existent. Marlene was more of a passive guardian than an actual maternal figure. The only person that Ellie really cared about was her best friend Riley. Riley was someone I think Ellie would have fought hard to live for. She gave her purpose. But I think after Riley's death, Ellie lost sight in living. After discovering that she is immune to the virus and the possibility that her genetic makeup could be used for finding a vaccine, I think Ellie would have been fine sacrificing herself for the greater good if she had to. Ellie suffers from survivor's guilt. Everyone that she had truly loved or cared about has either died or to some extent abandoned her. When Ellie and Joel first met, I think to some degree Ellie was already subconsciously resigned to die for the cure, even though dying for the cure wasn't part of the stipulation. Joel, on the other hand, was just existing with no grander purpose. I think he and Tess had something going on, and that was enough to get him through the day. So when Marlene proposed a job to him, that's all it was, just another job. Ellie was just another cargo. They were two separate people, worlds apart with no commonality. So when the incident occurred at the Capitol building, with the Firefly agents all being dead, Tess suffering from an infection and eventually killed by Fedra agents, Joel, if he truly was indifferent and devoid of compassion, could have just easily walked away. With the Firefly agents all dead, the contract was done, and he wasn't even sympathetic to their cause. But Joel, being a loyal person and feeling a sense of obligation to Tess, decided against his better judgment, and thus begins Ellie and Joel's year-long journey across the American wasteland. To pretend or ignore the critical fact that such a harrowing journey couldn't bring two people vastly different from one another closer together would be a denial in tragedy. Joel and Ellie had to overcome some of the most vile and unspeakable predicaments. They had to endure against every mutational offspring posed by the infecteds, from runners to stalkers, from clickers to bloaters. They had to survive against the worst of humankind, from hunters preying on the weak, human cannibal posse, and fascist authoritarian militants. The odds were stacked against them. They literally had to survive hell on earth. To pretend that they couldn't have developed a bond that becomes thicker than blood would be ignoring the most important aspect of the story, which is simply about a father caring for his daughter.
Look, it's me.
He tried to.
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay.
Joel.
It's okay.
By the time we get to Jackson, Ellie has already felt a sense of comfort being with Joel. A comfort that goes beyond just having someone protecting her. Ellie, to a degree, expresses her desire of a need and a want to be with Joel. Ultimately, she feels safe with him. He's the closest person she's ever had to a father figure. If she didn't feel this way, she wouldn't have felt rejected as she did when she realized Joel was trying to pass her off to Tommy. And Tommy effectively would have been a more suitable and capable protector because he used to be a Firefly himself. Joel, on the other hand, felt worried that he was getting too attached to Ellie. He might have assumed that once he delivers her to the Fireflies, that he'd lose her. Passing her off to Tommy was a way of protecting himself from an inevitable heartbreak. Now something happens that feels a little inconsistent about Ellie's motive to want to keep Joel with her. I don't know if it's an oversight by the writers or if it's something they intentionally left in for the sake of ambiguity, but we know that Ellie had already resigned herself in dying for the cause if it came down to it. We know this because she blames Joel for robbing her of her most important decision in The Last of Us 2. Because she never disclosed the fact that she was willing to sacrifice herself to Joel is a little self-serving and cruel if that is true. She understood why he was trying to get rid of her, because he didn't want to see her ending up like Sarah or ultimately losing her. Knowing all this and then still insisting that this poor old man who clearly cares for her needed to continue with her even though there could be a possibility in her mind that she was going to die is a little selfish and fucked up on her part. I'm just going to chalk this up to Ellie being a child and not really understanding what she truly wants. So now let's get to the main conflict between Ellie and Joel. Joel lied to her about what really happened at Salt Lake City, and Ellie ultimately blames him for violating her right to die for the cure. Honestly, I don't know why Joel is even held responsible. First of all, he's not a mind reader. I can only assume that Joel hasn't told her the full story. That's why he's taken the full brunt of Ellie's tirade. There was never any indication by anybody, including Marlene and upper management, that the operation would be life-threatening. Maybe they performed some blood tests on her, extract some skin tissues, but none of it would be deemed fatal. Ellie even jokes about it.
How will they do it?
Do what?
Get the cure from me? You think it'll hurt?
No, it'll probably just draw some blood. It don't hurt.
I've gotten shots before. They vaccinated us at school. It sucked.
Now, it wasn't until the 11th hour that it was revealed the operation would be fatalistic. Everyone, including the doc and Marlene, were absolutely shocked. Ellie has never made a public acknowledgement that she would have wanted to die for the cause. She may have harbored ideas about it to herself, but she had never explicitly given her consent to anyone. In Salt Lake City, Joel asked her if she wanted to continue. He was okay if she had doubts, but she didn't want their harrowing journey to have been for nothing. She wanted to get it over with. She wanted to see it through, but she makes a very important proclamation to Joel.
But there's no halfway with this. Once we're done, we'll go wherever you want. Okay?
Well, I ain't leaving without you. So let's go wrap this up.
They never entertained the idea that she might die. They never had that discussion. They never had a plan B. They were both going to walk out of there together and become family. Now, some people will tell you that this is irrelevant because it doesn't matter to the overall aspect of the story due to the high risk of uncertainty. Would she have died? Would she have survived? It doesn't matter because Ellie already made her decision. Well, I totally disagree with this idea. First of all, Ellie is a child. She certainly has more maturity than most people her age, and you could chalk that up to the rough environment she was brought up in, but the fact still remains, she is a 14-year-old child. When she brazenly chooses to continue with Joel instead of being passed off to Tommy, she's making a clear distinction that her and Joel's relationship has become more than just a smuggler-cargo dynamic. She's making it clear that Joel is the only adult figure she has complete and total trust in, a man whom she can relax all her defensiveness. She never comes out and says it, but we all know deep down inside her very core, she sees Joel as a father figure. Her very mannerisms post-Jackson reveals this, her effervescent childlike excitement after surviving the skirmish at the power plant, and her remorsefulness for her transgression against Joel's authority by stealing Tommy's horse, shows us that she deeply respects and loves Joel. With this new daughter-father dynamic shift in their relationship, Ellie in a sense has to relinquish some part of her autonomy to Joel. She has to understand that Joel, being the adult guardian that she herself personally elected, will have some governance over her. After all, he is the adult, he has a lot more life experience, and her, being only 14 despite being very mature, will not sometimes understand the full ramifications of her decisions. She has to have complete faith in Joel to make decisions for her best interests, if or when she is unable to make them for herself. So this brings us to this very confusing conflict. Why is Ellie accusing Joel for usurping her right? He did fulfill his responsibility as a father to make decisions in her best interests, which is protecting her life at all costs. The idea that Joel should have known to some degree that Ellie was willing to forfeit her life for the cure is asinine and stupid. She never voiced that opinion to him, and he isn't a telepath. They have an open communication, and if Ellie was truly okay with the idea of dying for the cure, she owed Joel that conceit. To blatantly assume that Joel could read her mind is ludicrous. To persuade Joel from escaping with Ellie, Marlene tells him down in the parking garage that is what she'd want, and you know it. This makes Joel self-reflect for a moment. Does he truly know that is what Ellie would have wanted? Ellie is a compassionate and caring person. Joel knows this. I'm sure he believes deep down that Marlene is right. But to base a life-altering decision such as this on a feeling or an assumption, is it good enough? I don't think so. Joel makes a compelling statement. This ain't for you to decide. And to me, this is the most important argument raised during the altercation. He is 100% correct. It isn't for Joel, Marlene, or even the Fireflies to decide whether Ellie should live or die based off of some presumption. This is Ellie's sole discretion to make. It is her life that hangs in the balance. She is not in any mortal danger. She's just knocked out. There is absolutely no reason to hasten the surgery. The Fireflies owed Ellie every right to be fully conscious before making her decision, but the Fireflies weren't willing to give her that opportunity. So who really violated Ellie's rights? It wasn't Joel. He wanted to speak to Ellie, get some closure. No, the true culprits were the Fireflies themselves. If this has been my defense of Joe Miller, then I can tell you now that this will be my indictment of the Fireflies. I'm going to attempt to explain this through Joe's perspective. Now, a lot of people seem to give the Fireflies a pass to do whatever they need to do in the name of altruism. Their methods and tactics are highly questionable. They blow up checkpoints, causing collateral damage and getting innocent people killed, assassinating important figureheads, torturing captives, and just seen as a cult or a terrorist group among the public. They are very Machiavellian in their pursuit of restoring society, but to some people, they are the beacon of hope. Now, are they truly the unsung heroes of The Last of Us? Are they the last bastion of a true unified front to save humanity? Like Joel, I saw through their bullshit right from the beginning. With an insurmountable of incriminating evidence stacked against them, my conclusion is that the Fireflies are nothing more than just another fascist militant regime out to proclaim their own sense of hegemony. They are no different than the Wolves. Seraphites are to an extent Fedra. They have their own sense of how the world should be run and will do anything to propagate their ideology. The only difference is that they are the only ones actively seeking a cure. Sometimes good intentions have been fraught with despicable and unspeakable crimes. Observe the old saying from Friedrich Nietzsche. Beware that, when fighting a monster, you yourself do not become a monster. Just because an organization tells you they want to do good with one hand, but then purposely performs actionable offenses against you with the other hand, might give you a clear indication that they are not to be trusted. These type of clandestine organizations need to be brought up to full scrutiny. Their first obvious major offense is the disturbing similarity to the militant faction that murdered Sarah in the opening cinematic sequence. Here you have a soldier that becomes conflicted with his orders. He questions them at first, but in the end became nothing more than an emotionless automaton. A machine executing an illegal order against helpless civilians. Now, you could argue that the military protocols were to eliminate any threat in the vicinity to contain the pandemic. But if that were the case, then there shouldn't have been any hesitation on his part. It seems like these soldiers are given some form of discretion before shooting a civilian. But no matter, his orders were more important than his ethics. So what does our benevolent Firefly do when he encounters an old man desperately trying to resuscitate a helpless child? Does he offer a helping hand? Does he at least try to analyze the situation and assess what's the best approach? No, not really. Instead, he knocks the old man out with the butt of his rifle. Do you not see the disturbing similarities that these two soldiers exhibit? Because if you don't, Joel certainly does. He recognizes that they're only out looking after themselves, pretending that they actually care about the greater good. Marlene's audio journal contains some nasty information that completely questions the Fireflies' ethical and moral fortitude. Apparently, the Fireflies wanted Marlene to kill Joel after he was able to do what they couldn't, delivering Ellie to them against overwhelming odds. Now, of course, Marlene doesn't kill Joel because she believes he might forgive her. But I also like to believe because she respects Tommy. But imagine if she hadn't known Joel in any capacity, or maybe if the smuggler was just some random person, they would have killed him on the spot for doing his job to help restore society. Now, how fucked up is that? Why is killing the one person that went out of their way to help your cause even an option? Is it because he knows their base of operation? Because they feared he might retaliate if he knew what they were about to do to his little girl? Because they didn't want anyone else to know about the vaccine? No matter how you try to spin it or defend their calculating behavior, the Fireflies cannot absolve themselves for having the propensity for being cold-blooded murderers. These people are no saints. You can tell yourself, well, they're trying to restore society and save humanity. They're allowed certain moral and ethical leeway. The end justifies the means, right? If you truly believe this, then I think you're part of the problem, and why the world is in the fucked up state that it's in, not because of some virus, but because of good old human indecency dressed up as its mutual defenders. Marlene puts on a good front. I'm sure she cares about Ellie in some magnitude. Ellie's her best friend's daughter. Her decision to sacrifice Ellie didn't come easy. You could see she was torn. But I don't believe for 1 second if Ellie was her biological daughter, she would have consented. Matter of fact, she would probably have done what Joel did. It's easier sacrificing someone else's kid for a cause but your own, especially in the apocalypse. Just look at Doc Jerry when Marlene posed the same question to him. He became almost catatonic. Jerry could barely respond. Even when Abby, his own daughter, confided that she would be willing to sacrifice herself for the cause, he was still dodging the issue. He had the look of total apprehension in his face. He would never have allowed it if it was his own daughter on the line. This whole idea about sacrificing the few to save the many shouldn't always be factored in as the ultimate solution. Even Ellie herself innately thinks it's shitty.
Do this?
Cute. And no, my money's on the military.
Why would they mow down all these people?
You can't let everyone in.
So they killed them?
And dead people don't get infected. You sacrifice the few to save the many.
It's kind of shitty.
Yeah.
She inherently understands that killing anyone against their will is never a good thing. And this brings us to the Firefly's most egregious violation. Make no mistake, it wasn't Joel who violated Ellie's rights, it was the Fireflies. Ellie has never explicitly stated or made a public declaration that she would be willing to sacrifice herself for the cure. She only harbored those ideas. Even though we know Ellie herself would have consented, it is not for Joel or anyone else to make that decision for her, especially based on assumptions or feelings. And because he has been elected by Ellie herself to be her paternal guardian, it is Joel's moral imperative to protect her best interest, which is to save her life. Make no mistake, Joel was morally justified to protect Ellie at all costs, especially knowing how corrupt and cruel the Fireflies are. He had no reason to trust these people, especially with the shit they put him through. If the Fireflies had any ounce of dignity and honor, they would have allowed Ellie to regain consciousness and let her make her own definitive decision. If the Fireflies had any sense of integrity to remain just and righteous, then they have the moral and ethical responsibility to get the final consent from Ellie before proceeding with the operation. But in their desperate act of vindication for all of the loss they've endured, they've made a unilateral decision to murder a child without her consent to justify their own cause. And you'd have to ask yourself, what was their reason to have wanted to hasten the operation? Why couldn't they have waited until Ellie was conscious? Why couldn't they have allowed Joel to see Ellie? They owed him that much. Ellie was in no mortal danger. I'd almost understand if Ellie's life was in peril. Let's say if she was on the verge of death, and if she had died, the cordyceps tissues they needed to extract would have been rendered useless. That would have at least explained something. They are torn. You could see the internal conflict in both of their faces. Marlene and Jerry are morally conflicted. They know what they're about to do is wrong, for compromising their own sense of humanity to save humanity. Getting Ellie's official approval would have lightened their burden and eased their conscience. But the unfortunate fact is, they had no excuse. I could only wonder, from Joel's perspective, did they do it out of their own sense of arrogance and misguided duty to save the world? No matter how noble their intentions are, they lost all credibility when they usurped Ellie's autonomy. From that very moment, Joel had no reason to support the cause, of which he had in a way, by explicitly bringing Ellie to them. My only conjecture as to why they didn't want Ellie to regain consciousness is because they might have doubted her ability to give them consent. She has been traveling with Joel close to a year, and they might have presumed with high probability that they developed a connection. Maybe Ellie has someone to live for now, therefore having no reason for her to throw her life away for something that is uncertain as a miracle cure. This is only my speculation, but if there's any ounce of truth from it, it makes the Fireflies much more sinister and diabolical. I'm not sorry to say, but in my opinion, the Fireflies are the true antagonists of the story. A lot of people give Joel shit for supposedly condemning humanity because he selfishly preferred saving a single life over the many. Their reason is purely based off of a mathematical conceit and not on any sense of morality. This holy grail that can save all of humanity. People are putting a lot of stock into this miracle cure. What are they actually expecting from it? Do they really think that such a vaccine, once created, would ideally bring peace and harmony across the wasteland? That disputing settlements and factions would put aside their grievances and sing kumbayas together around a campfire? If this was Uncharted or any other video game storyline, I'd almost believe that such a cure could exist. But this is The Last of Us, a video game narrative that is trying to be more realistic, more grounded, going deeper. It is a story that doesn't need to rely on a single encompassing solution. Is the cure even important to the overall nature of the story? Personally, I don't think it is. To me, the cure is what some would call a MacGuffin. A MacGuffin, or in this case the cure, is just an arbitrary object or device to keep the story moving forward. It is not important to the overall structure of the narrative. What is important is what's happening around it. The cure never becomes a tangible object in the first game, and it's even less prominent in the second game. But let's pretend for a second that indeed it does become a real, tangible object by the end of the first game. Let's pretend that Joel says fuck it and just walks away. Ellie's brain is carved up by Jerry, and the Fireflies manage to create the vaccine. Will this cure bring society back from its imminent demise? Realistically, I don't think that it can. I don't think a simple cure can save humanity. Best it can do is keep society from hemorrhaging like a bandage. Truthfully, I think humanity needs to save itself and not rely on some magical concoction. Hypothetically, what would really happen if the Fireflies created the vaccine? First of all, they wouldn't have the resources or infrastructure to distribute or administer it to a wide region of people. But logically, because of its scarcity, they'd probably just keep the vaccine for themselves. Eventually, the known existence of the cure would leak out, and soon, it will become this holy grail across the wasteland. Other settlements will want it for themselves, and an all-out war will break out. The Fireflies will not only be in the crosshairs of Fedra, but every other settlement they refuse to share the vaccine with. No kumbayas, just more senseless killings. But you have to ask yourself, did society break down and degenerated because of the pandemic, or was the underlying cause a much more sinister and natural human phenomenon? The outbreak happens, society shuts down, and people succumb to their most primitive and animalistic instinct, self-preservation. There will be a few rational humans who will help each other out and try to establish some sense of order. But as resources become scarce and morale diminishes, there will be a loud few that will seize the opportunity to take power. They will seek to divide and conquer, and slowly over time, try and carve out a piece of a bigger pie for themselves. The pandemic will not only give birth to the infected, but inadvertently will also give rise to the tyranny of evil men. For they are endemically the root of the problem, the real virus of which no cure can heal. If humanity truly wanted to extinguish the virus, they could have put aside all their petty grievances, unified, and systematically purged the infected colonies of spores, one by one, down to the last pollen. But instead, they divided themselves, preying on one another, convinced that this is the natural order of things, survival of the fittest, behaving like animals. But we are not animals. Human strives for a higher purpose of empathy and compassion. Jackson seems like the only real normalized settlement across the American wasteland. They seem to have established a rule of order that is fair and sensible. People are encouraged to make an honest living. Internal conflicts amongst the settlers have resulting parties talk it out. If you didn't want to live there anymore, you could leave on your own discretion without having to fear retribution or consequences. The infected, runners, stalkers, clickers, shamblers, and bloaters, they're just obstacles with predictable behavior, like most of our apex predators in the wild. Although extremely dangerous, they could be managed and isolated. A well-fortified and established settlement like Jackson could easily eradicate and control their propagation. The bigger problem is not fighting the infected, but protecting ourselves from our own kind. You probably have to kill more non-fungal motherfuckers trying to murder you for your shit, rather than actual infecteds trying to infect you. In my honest opinion, the cure is nothing more than a distraction. Humanity already has the ability to stomp out the infections if they could just put aside all their petty differences. The true source of decay and disruption of society's progression to heal itself is not due to some wild mutational offspring caused by the virus, but by the bleak, black, darkened hearts of countless people like the Hunters, the Rattlers, David and his cannibal posse, Isaac and the Wolves, Seraphites, and even to an extent, Fedra. Because in the end, there is no viable cure for human wickedness. Did Joel cross a lot of people? This is a very accepted belief by some players. Ellie even mentions it to Dina in The Last of Us 2, but my presumption as to why she says this is due to the fact that she doesn't know the full story. Because of this notion, some people believe that Joel should have been more inconspicuous and not casually reveal his identity to strangers. But whom did he cross exactly? Nowhere in the narrative of the game did Joel deliberately or intentionally cross anyone that didn't have it coming. You can also play the game stealthily with minimal human casualties. You didn't have to slaughter all the Fireflies. This is the whole ludonarrative dissonance argument, where gameplay conflicts with the story. For instance, if you played the Grand Theft Auto series, as a gameplay mechanic, you can choose to kill and murder a lot of the innocent bystanders to rack up your star levels, and none of those deaths will matter in the overall scheme of the story. Much like in The Last of Us, you do not have to kill any of the Firefly combatants if you choose to play it stealthily, but the canon of the story will still end with the conclusion that Joel slaughtered the Fireflies. Now, did Joel cross the Fireflies? Of course not. They were the ones holding Ellie hostage without her consent. So who did Joel really cross then? Technically, he didn't cross anybody. But the one character that you could almost feel sympathy or uncomfortable killing was Doc Jerry. He was the only non-combatant that we, the players, was forced to kill. Did Joel cross the Doc? I admit, as a player, I felt uncomfortable that I was forced to kill a character that really wasn't deemed a physical threat. Myself, playing the game, if given the choice, if this was a choice-based game, which it isn't, it's a linear-based game, but if given the choice, I wouldn't have killed him. But if I were to put myself into Joel's mind at the exact moment in a roleplay, I certainly understand why Joe did what he did. Although the Doc wasn't an immediate physical threat, he was complicit in murdering Ellie without her consent. I mean, he had the scalpels ready to go. Because we as the players were forced to kill the Doc, I think Naughty Dog already had the story for Last of Us 2 locked down, even before pre-production. The Doc was certainly guilty by association, and although he had the scalpel ready, he is still considered by most people a non-combatant. So did Joel cross the Doc? It's hard to say. Joel never had interacted with him until that unfortunate moment. But I'll say this. Abby didn't seek vengeance against Joel for slaughtering the Fireflies. She sought vengeance in memory of her father. If Joel hadn't killed the Doc, I think Abby wouldn't have been consumed by her righteous fury. And like Ellie, Abby doesn't know the full story. I'm going out on a limb on this one and presume that if Abby had known that it was the Fireflies that crossed Joel when they took the unilateral decision to murder Ellie for their cause without Ellie's consent, the same consent that she was able to give her father, I don't think she would have entertained the idea of avenging her father since he was complicit. With all the incriminating evidence stacked against the Fireflies for compromising their moral integrity, I don't know how any sane, rational human being would choose in any way to submit to their authority. Just because they tell you they want to save the world doesn't mean they should be given carte blanche to do whatever they want. Joel had every right to challenge the Fireflies' unethical treatment of Ellie. So why did Ellie ultimately blame Joel for violating her autonomy? I think the only real crime that Joel committed was lying to her about the outcome of the Fireflies. But make no mistake, it's an innocuous violation compared to what the Fireflies would have done. And that is the real crime against Ellie. Not Joel lying to her about what happened to the Fireflies. Yes, it sucks being lied to, but it's a hard pill she's just going to have to swallow. So why does she ultimately blame Joel then? I can only assume that Joel hasn't told her the full story. The story being, Joel fulfilled his duty to Tess and delivered Ellie to the Fireflies. Now, did he get a welcoming reception? No. They knocked his ass out for trying to resuscitate an unconscious and drown Ellie. They then proceed to tell him that the mutation has changed and that the operation would eventually kill Ellie. And instead of trying to get Ellie's permission, which would have been ethically the right thing to do, they immediately put her on the operating table. They should have given Joel and Ellie this opportunity to discuss this life-altering decision. They owed them that much. Ellie was in no danger of dying. They had ample time. Joel has become Ellie's rightful guardian. Marlene relinquished that right when she handed Ellie away. Now, if Ellie agreed to the operation and Joel still resisted and slaughtered the Fireflies, then you can make that argument. But that's not what happened. Imagine if the roles were reversed and it was Ellie delivering Joel to the Fireflies for some simple blood tests. Upon finding out that the operation would eventually kill Joel, and Ellie and Joel never having the discussion about him voluntarily dying for the cure, do you think Ellie would have allowed the Fireflies to continue with the operation? Fuck no. She would have done exactly what Joel did. If Joel had told her the full story and she still blames him, then I can chalk that up to Ellie being overly naive and hypocritical. That tells me she doesn't fully understand the natural relationship between a parent and a child, that it is the parent's role to protect their children at all costs. But she's young and naive despite her maturity, and Joel understood this. That's why I think he made up the story, thinking maybe once she gets a little older and has children of her own, she would finally understand. She never knew her father, and Joel fulfilled that emptiness. He's given her more love than anyone she's ever known, and that is why Ellie did what she did in The Last of Us 2. Now, I missed this the first time playing The Last of Us 2 because I was tired or just in shock. But the scene where Ellie and Dina walked to Joel's home to pay their tribute, there were countless well-wishing flowers and cards from the people of Jackson strewn throughout the front lawn. If Joel was such a terrible person, would they have expressed their sadness and condolences in such a magnitude? Of course not. If Joel was a selfish asshole, why did he jeopardize his own safety and risk it for the life of a complete stranger? Because he wasn't. Millions of players adore Joel across the world for his bravery, and dare I say it, selflessness. Why did I feel the need to make this video? Because, despite all his flaws, Joel Miller will always be our ideal hero.
Needless to say, I'm odds and